For about 24 hours this weekend, the United States and Israel were preparing to launch one of the most devastating bombing campaigns of this entire war, a coordinated strike on Iran's actual energy infrastructure, the power plants and grid systems that keep the country running. American embassies across the Middle East told citizens to be ready to leave. The State Department told Americans across the entire region to reconsider travel altogether. And then, late Saturday night, it didn't happen. Give me the next few minutes because I'm going to walk you through exactly what was being planned, why it would have been unlike almost anything this war has seen so far, and why it got called off at the very last possible moment. Before we get into the details, here's why this exact sequence of events deserves careful attention rather than a quick sigh of relief and moving on. A war can de-escalate for genuinely good reasons, real diplomatic progress, exhaustion on both sides, outside pressure from allies, or it can simply pause the same way it's paused before, only to pick back up again once the underlying disagreements reassert themselves. Telling those two outcomes apart in the moment is genuinely difficult, and by the end of this video you'll have everything you need to make that judgment for yourself rather than just taking the headline at face value. Here's where this starts. On Friday, multiple sources told CBS News that the United States and Israel were planning what would be one of the harshest bombing campaigns to date against energy infrastructure targets inside Iran, with strikes possible as soon as this weekend. Two separate U.S. officials confirmed the same basic picture to CNN. Fresh strikes on Iran were being prepared for as early as this weekend, though the precise scope and specific targets weren't immediately clear, and both officials cautioned the strikes could still be called off before they happened. Trump himself had previewed this shift just days earlier, telling reporters at a cabinet meeting, "We will be hitting them very hard," while venting frustration at diplomatic efforts that had repeatedly fallen short. Stick around, because in the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what made this specific planned strike different from everything else in this war, why American citizens across multiple countries were being told to prepare to evacuate, what role Saudi Arabia played in stopping it at the last minute, and why this exact same pattern, a threatened strike on Iran's energy grid followed by a sudden pause, has already happened once before in this war. Here's the detail that makes this weekend's plan genuinely different from most of what's come before it. According to CNN's reporting, the U.S. military had made preparations to launch a series of strikes targeting Iranian nuclear infrastructure, including Pickaxe Mountain, the fortified underground site south of Tehran that's been threatened repeatedly throughout this war, but never actually struck. Those preparations, officials said, had picked up real momentum in the days immediately before this weekend. That's a meaningfully different target category than most of the nightly strikes this war has produced. Energy infrastructure and a site widely believed to be central to Iran's nuclear ambitions, hit in the same coordinated window, would represent an entirely different order of escalation than the command centers, drone storage sites, and coastal missile installations that have made up the bulk of this war's target list so far. Let's talk about why targeting energy infrastructure specifically is treated so differently from targeting military hardware, because that distinction is central to understanding why this weekend's plan alarmed so many people so quickly. Power plants and grid infrastructure aren't purely military assets. They keep hospitals running, water treatment plants operating, and ordinary civilian life functioning for tens of millions of people who have no role in this war's decision-making. That's exactly why previous threats to strike this specific category of target, something Trump has raised multiple times over the course of this war, have consistently drawn warnings from legal experts about the line between legitimate military targeting and strikes that could cross into war crimes territory under international law. It's worth understanding the legal reasoning behind that concern in a bit more depth, because it's not just a rhetorical talking point. Under the laws of armed conflict, infrastructure that serves both civilian and military purposes, what's often called dual-use infrastructure, occupies a genuinely contested legal category. A power plant that helps run a country's air defense radar also keeps refrigeration running in hospitals and water pumps operating for millions of ordinary households. Striking that kind of target isn't automatically illegal under international law, but it requires a proportionality analysis that weighs the military value of the strike against the civilian harm it's likely to cause, and it's exactly the kind of calculation that becomes far more fraught when the stated target is the energy grid itself rather than a specific military facility that happens to draw power from that grid. That's the tightrope any government walks the moment energy infrastructure becomes an explicit target category rather than an incidental consequence of hitting something more narrowly military. Here's how seriously the diplomatic and security apparatus around this region treated the threat, because it wasn't limited to vague public statements. U.S. Embassies in several Middle Eastern capitals, including Amman and Jordan, Jerusalem and Baghdad, issued warnings to American citizens on Saturday, specifically flagging the risk of what they called unforeseen escalation in the regional conflict, urging people to be ready to leave on short notice. The State Department separately renewed a broader travel advisory for the entire Middle East, telling Americans to exercise caution and heightened vigilance, and to be prepared for flight cancellations, periodic airspace closures, and other travel disruptions. Americans already planning trips to the region were told to seriously reconsider. That's not routine boilerplate travel guidance. That's the kind of specific urgent language governments use when they genuinely believe a major escalation is imminent, not just possible. Let's talk about what was already happening on the ground, even before this weekend's planned strikes, because the region wasn't calm going into this. Iran said Friday it had attacked an American base in Kuwait, and early Saturday, Kuwait's military reported its air defenses actively intercepting Iranian drone attacks. In a public statement, Kuwait's army said, Kuwaiti air defenses are currently confronting hostile drone attacks following the sinful Iranian aggression, adding that any explosion sounds residents heard were the result of its own air defense systems successfully intercepting the incoming threats. Kuwait has been targeted by Iran multiple times throughout this war, specifically in retaliation for American strikes, given its role hosting U.S. forces in the region. Here's another incident from the exact same window that shows how active the broader maritime conflict remained, even as everyone waited to see whether the big weekend strike would actually happen. A tanker was struck by what a British maritime agency described as an unknown projectile off the coast of Oman on Saturday, as the United States and Iran continued vying for control over the Strait of Hormuz. According to ABC News, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Agency reported 2 separate incidents in the strait that same day. One where a tanker's captain reported seeing a large explosion and splash close to the vessel without confirmed damage, and a second, more serious incident roughly 11 nautical miles northeast of a location called Lima, Oman, where a tanker was actually struck by a projectile that damaged its engine room, with no casualties or environmental impact reported at that time. Let's talk about the specific diplomatic intervention that appears to have actually stopped this weekend's planned strikes, because it came from a source that carries real weight in the region. CBS News learned that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman spoke directly with President Trump on Saturday and specifically cautioned him against conducting a fresh round of strikes on Iran. That's not a minor diplomatic gesture. Saudi Arabia sits at the center of the exact regional stability this entire war has been threatening, and a direct personal call from its crown prince urging restraint carries a different kind of weight than a written statement from a foreign ministry spokesperson. It's worth understanding exactly why Saudi Arabia has such a direct stake in whether this specific strike happened, separate from any general regional diplomacy. The kingdom sits geographically close to Iran, hosts its own American military presence, and has spent this entire war absorbing spillover effects from a conflict it isn't directly fighting, disrupted oil markets, regional instability, and the constant risk of Iranian retaliation landing on its own soil or against its own shipping. A strike specifically targeting Iran's energy infrastructure and a site tied to its nuclear program represented exactly the kind of maximalist escalation Saudi Arabia has consistently tried to prevent throughout this war, worried that pushing Iran into a truly cornered position could produce a far less predictable and far more dangerous response than the grinding, if bloody, pattern of strikes and counterstrikes that had defined the conflict up to this point. That's likely exactly why Mohammed bin Salman felt this specific moment warranted a direct, personal call rather than routing his concerns through normal diplomatic channels. Here's Iran's side of this exact same conversation, because Tehran wasn't sitting passively waiting to see what Washington would decide. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, told his Saudi counterpart on Saturday that any American or Israeli attack on Iran would meet what he called a proportionate response. That's a carefully chosen phrase, not a threat of unlimited or unrestrained retaliation, but a specific commitment to match whatever escalation came from the other side. Separately, the Iranian body responsible for overseeing passage through the Strait of Hormuz said that Tehran-approved transits through the waterway could gradually resume once stability and calm are restored, posting on social media that due to what it called the continued aggressive actions of U.S. military forces in the region, transit through the strait wasn't currently possible at all. U.S. Central Command pushed back directly on that claim, saying the waterway remained open for commercial vessel transit, regardless of what Tehran was asserting, adding pointedly, Iran does not control it. Let's talk about what actually happened Saturday night, because this is where the entire story pivots. President Trump announced on Truth Social that he was canceling the planned attack, saying the decision came in response to requests from Iran and other Middle Eastern countries to hold off any attack and that the perimeters of a deal has been agreed to. He said he had agreed to that request on the condition that any deal be concluded quickly. According to his post, the proposed agreement would include what he called the immediate, complete, and total opening of the Hormuz Strait, along with an end to what he described as Iran's nuclear threat. Trump added that the United States remained, in his words, locked and loaded and ready to go against Iran if that deal didn't materialize, and said Israel had agreed to join the pause in strikes as well. As of the most recent reporting available, Iran had not issued any official public response to Trump's announcement. Here's why that specific phrase, perimeters of a deal, deserves a closer look rather than being taken entirely at face value. It's a notably vague, informal way to describe what would be one of the most consequential diplomatic breakthroughs of the entire war, ending months of grinding conflict and reopening one of the world's most important shipping lanes. There's no confirmation yet of exactly which specific terms have actually been agreed to. No signed document, no joint statement from Iran's own government confirming the same framework Trump described. That doesn't mean that diplomatic progress isn't real. Multiple regional countries were clearly pushing hard for exactly this outcome, based on MBS's direct call and the broader pattern of regional pressure. But perimeters of a deal is meaningfully different language than a deal, and that distinction matters for understanding how solid this specific pause actually is. It's worth thinking through what perimeters specifically implies as a word choice, because language like this in diplomatic announcements is rarely accidental. A perimeter describes the outer boundary of something, the general shape of an agreement, not its finished interior details. Announcing that the perimeters of a deal have been agreed to is a meaningfully weaker claim than announcing a deal itself, closer to saying both sides have agreed on the rough shape of what a resolution might eventually look like, without yet having settled the specific, often much harder details that determine whether an agreement like this actually holds once negotiators get into the room and start working through implementation. That's exactly the kind of framing that gives a government maximum flexibility to describe genuine diplomatic momentum without locking itself into commitments it hasn't fully verified can actually be met. Let's talk about something that should genuinely worry you if this deal falls apart the way past ones have, because America's own capacity to keep intercepting Iranian attacks isn't unlimited. According to reporting citing the Center for Strategic and International Studies, using open-source budget figures provided to Congress, U.S. Patriot interceptor inventories have fallen from roughly 2,300 before this war began to fewer than 827. THAAD interceptor inventories have dropped from 452 down to fewer than 278. Military planners are reportedly weighing whether the current cycle of limited retaliatory strikes can even continue, given how depleted those stockpiles have become. That's the backdrop. This entire diplomatic pause is sitting inside. Not just a war that's dragged on for months, but one where the specific defensive systems protecting American forces and allied countries from Iranian missiles and drones are running low enough that military planners are having to factor that scarcity directly into their strategic decisions. Think about what that specific decline actually represents in practical terms. Losing roughly 2/3 of your Patriot interceptor stockpile and nearly 40% of your THAAD interceptors over the course of a single war isn't a minor logistics footnote. Those are the exact systems responsible for shooting down the missiles and drones Iran has launched at American bases, allied countries, and commercial shipping throughout this entire conflict. Every interceptor fired to protect a base in Kuwait, a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, or a city in Israel draws down a finite, difficult to replace supply, one that can't simply be manufactured on the same timeline this war has been moving at. If that supply keeps shrinking at anything close to its current rate, American and allied forces in the region could eventually face a genuinely difficult choice between accepting more risk from unintercepted attacks or further scaling back the offensive operations that keep triggering Iranian retaliation in the first place. That's a factor that rarely makes it into the public diplomatic language around pauses like this one, but it's almost certainly part of the calculation happening well behind the scenes. Here's why this pattern, threatening Iran's energy infrastructure and then pulling back at the last minute, isn't actually new to this war, because it's happened before in almost identical form. Back in late March, President Trump ordered the Department of War to postpone strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, citing what he called very good and productive conversations with Iran over the preceding 2 days. In a Truth Social post at the time, he wrote that based on the tenor and tone of those in-depth, detailed, and constructive conversations, he was instructing a full pause on military strikes against Iranian power plants specifically, subject to the success of continued talks throughout that week. That pause was explicitly tied to a threat Trump had made earlier, that the U.S. would target Iran's energy plants directly if Tehran didn't reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with Iran separately threatening to retaliate against regional infrastructure, including desalination facilities, if the U.S. actually followed through. Let's talk about how that earlier March pause actually played out, because it's directly relevant to how much confidence to place in this current one. The 5-day delay came and went. Rather than resolving cleanly, Trump extended his deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz to April 6th, saying talks were going very well, even as Iran had, just a day earlier, dismissed a 15-point ceasefire plan Trump had proposed. Trump insisted publicly that Iran was begging to make a deal and urged Tehran's leadership to get serious soon, while U.S. stocks fell sharply and oil prices climbed again as markets lost confidence that the war was actually nearing an end. By that point, according to figures cited at the time, the war had already killed more than 1,900 people in Iran and nearly 1,100 in Lebanon. That earlier round of energy infrastructure brinkmanship, threat, pause, extended deadline, dismissed proposal, didn't end the war. It simply delayed the next round of escalation by a matter of weeks. It's worth walking through that entire March sequence step by step, because the parallels to this current weekend aren't vague or approximate, they're remarkably specific. A threat to strike Iran's energy infrastructure. A short pause justified by productive or constructive conversations. A deadline that got extended once talks appeared to stall. Confident public statements insisting Iran was desperate to negotiate. And underneath all of it, markets reacting nervously each time confidence in an actual resolution wavered. Watching that exact sequence play out once already in careful detail is precisely why this current cancellation deserves scrutiny rather than simple relief. Markets, diplomats, and ordinary people watching this war unfold have all been here before, and the previous time this exact pattern played out, it bought weeks rather than ending anything. Here's why understanding that history matters so much for reading this current weekend's cancellation correctly. This isn't the first time Trump has publicly threatened Iran's energy infrastructure specifically, and it isn't the first time a last-minute diplomatic intervention has paused that exact threat right before it was set to happen. The specific language is even echoing itself. Productive conversations in March, perimeters of a deal now in August. If this current pause follows the same pattern the March one did, the most likely near-term outcome isn't a final, lasting resolution to this war. It's another temporary delay, followed by renewed brinkmanship over the same fundamental disputes, the Strait of Hormuz, Iran's nuclear program, and the broader question of what it would actually take for Washington to consider this conflict over. Let's talk about what's actually different this time, because there are a few genuine distinctions worth naming even given how closely this echoes March. This time, the planned target set explicitly included preparations against Pickaxe Mountain specifically, a site tied directly to Iran's nuclear ambitions, rather than just its power grid. This time, Saudi Arabia's crown prince personally intervened with a direct call to the president, a more senior, more personal form of regional pressure than the broader multilateral messaging that characterized the diplomatic environment back in March. And this time, America's own missile defense interceptor stockpiles have continued draining throughout the months in between, meaning the strategic cost-benefit calculation around continuing this war looks meaningfully different for you. Less military planners than it did 5 months ago, even if the diplomatic language sounds nearly identical. It's worth weighing those three distinctions against each other, because they don't all point in the same direction. The Pickaxe Mountain preparations suggest this round of planning was more ambitious and more escalatory than March's threat, which focused primarily on the power grid alone. That would normally suggest a harder, more determined push toward actually following through. But the direct personal nature of MBS's intervention, combined with the genuine scarcity now facing America's own interceptor stockpiles, both point toward more pressure to actually make a pause stick this time, not less. Those two sets of forces, a more ambitious military plan on one side and stronger incentives to avoid actually executing it on the other, are pulling in opposite directions, and that tension is a big part of why it's genuinely difficult to predict with confidence which way this particular pause ultimately breaks. Now, let's bring this all together because the individual threads genuinely do connect into a coherent picture once you line them up. The United States and Israel spent this past week preparing what officials themselves described as one of the harshest bombing campaigns of the entire war, targeting Iran's actual energy infrastructure alongside preparations against its most fortified nuclear-linked site. That preparation was serious enough to trigger formal evacuation warnings from American embassies across 3 separate countries and a region-wide State Department travel advisory. It was serious enough that Kuwait was actively intercepting Iranian drones, and a tanker was struck by an unidentified projectile in the Strait of Hormuz in the same general window. And it was stopped at the very last moment, not by a change of heart inside the Trump administration itself, but reportedly by direct personal intervention from Saudi Arabia's crown prince, arriving just in time to pause a strike that had already picked up serious operational momentum in the days before. So here's the honest way to understand where this specific moment actually leaves things. Nothing described as devastating or unstoppable in this video's title has actually happened. The strikes were prepared, seriously enough to trigger real diplomatic and military mobilization, and then called off at the final hour based on a diplomatic framework that, as of right now, exists mostly in the form of Trump's own social media description of it, rather than any confirmed signed agreement from Iran's side. Given that an almost identical sequence played out in March, energy infrastructure threatened, a pause announced, productive conversations cited, and given that this earlier pause ultimately dissolved back into renewed brinkmanship within weeks, there's real reason for caution before assuming this weekend's cancellation represents anything more permanent than history suggests it might. It's worth stepping back and asking what it would actually take for a pause like this one to be different from March, rather than just hoping it is. A durable resolution would need something the March pause never actually produced. A verified, mutually confirmed set of terms, not just one side's summary of a conversation. It would need Iran's own government to publicly confirm the same framework Trump described, rather than staying silent the way it has so far. And it would need to survive the first real test of an ambiguous incident, a tanker strike, a drone intercepted, an unclear provocation, the exact kind of event that's derailed nearly every previous attempt at de-escalation throughout this entire war. Until this specific pause survives that kind of test, it remains, at best, a genuinely hopeful sign rather than a confirmed turning point. What do you think happens next? Do you think this perimeters of a deal framework actually holds and turns into the kind of comprehensive resolution Trump described, full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and an end to Iran's nuclear threat? Or do you think this is simply March all over again? A temporary pause that buys a few weeks before the same underlying disputes drag this war right back to the exact same point? And given how depleted America's own Patriot and THAAD interceptor stockpiles have become, do you think that scarcity is quietly shaping these decisions, as much as the diplomacy itself, pushing toward pauses, not just because talks are genuinely working, but because sustaining another full-scale defensive effort is becoming a real strategic constraint? There's also a real question worth asking about Saudi Arabia's growing role in all of this. If it was a direct call from Mohammed bin Salman that stopped this specific strike, does that suggest Riyadh now holds more practical leverage over how this war unfolds than either Washington or Tehran might be comfortable admitting publicly? Drop your thoughts below. Here's a full rundown of where every piece of this came from, so you can verify it yourself. The planned weekend strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure, the Pickaxe Mountain preparations, and the State Department and embassy warnings come from CNN and CBS News live coverage from July 31st and August 1st, corroborated by ABC News, and AOL's coverage citing the BBC. The Kuwait drone interception and the tanker incidents in the Strait of Hormuz come from CBS News and ABC News live coverage from the same period. The Saudi Crown Prince's direct call to Trump comes from CBS News reporting. Iran's foreign minister's comments to his Saudi counterpart in the Strait of Hormuz transit dispute between Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority and CENTCOM come from CNN's live coverage. Trump's Truth social announcement canceling the strikes and describing the perimeters of a deal comes directly from his own post, as reported by Al Jazeera, CNN, ABC News, and AOL. The Patriot and THAAD interceptor depletion figures come from Fox News reporting, citing the Center for Strategic and International Studies analysis of congressional budget data. The March precedent, including the 5-day postponement, the extended Strait of Hormuz deadline, and the dismissed 15-point ceasefire plan, comes from Fox News, Barkhart, and Bloomberg's reporting from that period, with the casualty figures sourced to Barkhart's coverage, citing reporting available at the time. I want to be direct about the timing of everything in this video, because this story is developing in real time, and that matters for how you should read it. As of this recording, Trump's cancellation announcement is only hours old. Iran has not yet issued any official public response to the specific framework he described, and there's no independent confirmation of exactly what terms both sides have actually agreed to beyond Trump's own summary. That means everything in the second half of this video, the perimeters of a deal, the promised reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, the end to Iran's nuclear threat, should be understood as the American side's own characterization of where things stand right now, not a fully verified, jointly confirmed agreement. Given this war's own history of similar announcements not holding up cleanly, that distinction is worth keeping in mind as this story continues to unfold over the coming days. That's the real story behind this weekend's near miss, laid out with every piece traceable back to where it actually came from, rather than compressed into a single dramatic headline that skips over how uncertain this specific pause actually is. It's easy to see a headline announcing a canceled strike and a deal, and assume the story has a clean, happy ending. The reality sitting underneath that headline is far messier. An ambitious, potentially devastating military plan that got as far as triggering embassy evacuation warnings across 3 countries, stopped at the 11th hour by a personal phone call based on an agreement whose actual terms remain, as of right now, described only by one side. That's not necessarily a story without hope. Real diplomatic pressure clearly moved something in a matter of hours this weekend, and that's genuinely worth taking seriously. But it's also not the finished, confirmed resolution the headline framing might suggest, and this war's own recent history is the clearest evidence for why that distinction matters. Thanks for watching. And I'll be back the moment we learn whether this deal actually holds, or whether this becomes just the latest chapter in a pattern that's already repeated itself once before.